Have you ever thought about what it must be like to run a company? Like, really think about it. All those moving parts, all those people, all those decisions. Talk about a recipe for disaster.
It really can be. One wrong move, and the whole house of cards can come crashing down.
Exactly. Which is why I think getting this whole risk management thing right is so crucial. And it's not just about avoiding the big blowups either.
No, not at all. It's about making smarter choices, being more proactive, seeing those icebergs before you hit them. Really, it's about setting your organization up for long-term success.
Okay, so let's get into it then. Today, we are diving deep into the very first step in risk management, and that is establishing the risk management context.
Setting the stage, so to speak.
Exactly. And we are basing our deep dive on a fantastic article, as always, this time by Pritesh Biswas, who really breaks it down. And I think it's super relevant to anyone, by the way, whether you're, prepping for a board meeting
Oh, absolutely.
or just trying to figure out how your own company ticks.
Or even if you're just curious about what makes organizations tick.
Yeah, this is for you. So what we're going to do today is pull out the really key parts of this process of establishing that risk management context, and then we're going to try to make them clear and actionable for you. And as I mentioned, the article breaks it down into three parts. You have the risk management context itself, you've got the internal context, and then you have the external context.
Kind of like those Russian dolls, nested within each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so first things first, let's start with, the risk management context overall. So this isn't about identifying specific risks at this stage.
No, not yet. Not the nitty-gritty details just yet.
This is more, I guess, about how the organization approaches risk in general.
Right.
Like, what's their philosophy? What's their overall game plan?
Yeah. You could think of it as setting the rules of the game before you even step onto the field.
Perfect. Okay, so Biswas says that the risk management framework has two main jobs, right?
Right.
The first one is, obviously, it needs to, support the whole process of managing risk within the organization.
The day-to-day operations, keeping things running smoothly.
Yeah. But then the second thing, which I thought was interesting, was that it needs to make sure that everything that's learned, during this process is shared both within the organization, so like across teams, but then also outside with external stakeholders.
Transparency is key. It builds trust and makes everyone feel like they're in the loop. And let's not forget, it helps with continuous improvement. You share what you learn, you get feedback, and you do better next time.
Okay, so it's not enough to just do the work. You've got to talk about it. You've got to communicate it.
Absolutely.
Now, he brings up this acronym, RASP.
RASP.
Risk, Architecture, Strategy, and Protocols.
3 pillars.
Okay, so tell me, what exactly is this RASP, and why is it so important?
RASP is basically the foundation of your risk management efforts. It's the framework, the structure that defines how you, as an organization, will identify, assess, and respond to risks. It's kind of like a blueprint for handling uncertainty.
Okay, so it's the plan, the roadmap, the how-to guide for dealing with risk.
Exactly. And the key here, as Biswas emphasizes, is the risk management policy statement. This is where it all starts. This is the document that outlines your organization's commitment to risk management, its core principles, its philosophy, its overall approach.
It's like, what is it, the mission statement for how to deal with risk.
Yeah, exactly. Like a constitution for risk management, laying down the fundamental laws of the land.
I like that. And obviously, senior management has to be fully on board with all of this, right?
They're the ones steering the ship, after all.
Yeah.
And their buy-in is not just important, it's absolutely essential.
So it's not like a nice-to-have kind of thing?
No, this is a must-have.
Okay, so Biswas really emphasizes the importance of a mandate from senior management.
A clear and unequivocal directive that defines the scope, the authority, the responsibility for everything related to risk management.
So who's in charge, what they can do, where their power lies, all of that.
Exactly. And often it will even specify roles like the risk manager or the head of internal audit. Who's accountable.
Right. And this mandate shouldn't just be like a verbal agreement, right?
No, it needs to be formally documented, written down in black and white, preferably as part of that risk management policy we talked about earlier.
Okay, so it's official, it's on the record, it's not just a handshake agreement.
Exactly. Because without that clear backing from the top, any risk management initiative is likely to be, ineffective.
Okay, so it's top down, it's got to come from the leadership, they've got to be driving this.
Absolutely.
Now, another thing he brings up is risk appetite and risk criteria.
Yeah, that's where things get a little more specific.
Okay.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, this is all about kind of setting the boundaries of what's considered acceptable risk, right?
It's like deciding how much heat you're willing to take before you jump out of the kitchen.
Okay, I like that analogy.
So, risk appetite, that's your overall comfort level with uncertainty. How much risk are you willing to stomach in pursuit of those strategic objectives?
So it's like saying, okay, we're willing to take some risks, but we're not going to go completely crazy.
Right, you're defining your limits. And then risk criteria. Those are the specific benchmarks, the measuring sticks you use to decide whether a particular risk falls within those acceptable boundaries.
So it's not just, a vague feeling, oh, we're risk averse. It's actually, here's what we will tolerate.
Exactly. You might say, our risk appetite is moderate, but then your criteria might specify that no single event should result in a financial loss greater than, say, 5% of annual revenue.
Okay, so it's measurable, it's concrete.
It has to be, because these two concepts, risk appetite and risk criteria, they're the bedrock of your risk management context.
Okay, so they inform every decision you make, from how you identify risks to how you deal with them.
They determine how you prioritize risks, what kind of controls you implement, and ultimately whether the level of risk that remains is something the organization can live with.
Right, so it all comes back to these two things.
You're the foundation.
Okay. Biswas also mentioned this model called PM.
PMML, yeah.
That's plan, implement, measure, learn.
A practical roadmap.
Okay, so is this like a practical guide for how to actually, implement this whole framework?
It is. It's a cyclical model, emphasizing that risk management is not a one-time project. It's an ongoing process.
Right.
So you plan your approach, you implement the plan, you measure how well it's working, and then you learn from the results.
Okay, so it's iterative, it's about adapting, it's about constantly improving.
Exactly. And the cycle repeats. You learn, you adjust, you plan again, and so on.
Okay, and I think, the goal here with all of this, with the policy, with the mandate, with the appetite, with the PML model, it's not just about, avoiding bad stuff. It's really about supporting the organization's overall strategic goals.
Absolutely. It's about aligning risk management with what the organization wants to achieve.
So it's not just a defensive mechanism.
Yeah.
It's actually, a tool to help the organization succeed.
It's about being proactive, not just reactive.
Okay. Now, Biswas talks about building a risk-aware culture. And he uses this acronym, LIL.
LIL, right. It stands for leadership, involvement, learning, accountability, and communication.
Okay, so 5 key ingredients.
Think of them as the essential vitamins for a healthy, risk-aware culture.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about these vitamins.
Well, leadership is crucial, right? It sets the tone from the top. Involvement means that everyone in the organization, at every level, is engaged in risk management.
Right, so it's not just like the risk management department's problem.
No, it's everyone's responsibility.
Okay, and then learning, obviously, means that the organization is constantly, learning from its mistakes, from its successes, from its experiences with risk.
Learning and adapting, always evolving.
Okay, accountability.
That means people are held responsible for their actions and decisions related to risks.
Right, so there's some skin in the game.
Exactly. And finally, communication is about making sure that risk information is flowing freely and effectively throughout the organization.
Up, down, sideways, all around.
Right. Because without this open communication, well, the whole system can break down.
Okay, so that's LILAC. Those are the 5 key ingredients for building a risk-aware culture.
Absolutely.
Now, the last thing Biswas talks about in this initial context section is this idea of a risk radar.
A radar for risk sounds interesting.
I know, it sounds kind of high-tech.
Well, it is about staying ahead of the curve. It's a mechanism for spotting those emerging risks that might not be obvious.
The ones that aren't on your immediate radar.
Exactly. It's about scanning the horizon, looking for those potential future threats that might be lurking out there.
Right, so it's not just about the risk you know about, it's also about the ones you don't know about yet.
Exactly. It's about being proactive, anticipating the unexpected.
And that actually ties in nicely to the next section,
Okay.
which is the internal context. So now we're shifting gears a bit. We're going from the overall framework, the risk management context, to looking inward at the organization itself.
Right. Time for some introspection.
Exactly. So this is about really understanding the organization, its activities, its resources, its skills, its structure, its culture.
It's like holding up a mirror and taking a good long look.
Yeah. And Biswas also emphasizes, the importance of internal stakeholders.
Of course, your employees, your contractors, anyone who's working within the organization, their expectations matter.
Okay. And I guess this internal assessment helps to identify the organization's strengths and weaknesses.
The things that might help or hinder their ability to manage risks effectively.
Right. So it's not just about, the physical assets, the financial health.
Mm.
It's also about the people, the culture, those intangible things.
The human factor, the organizational DNA.
Now, Biswas mentions the firm risk scorecard, and he also brings up SWOT and PESTLE as useful tools for, evaluating this internal environment.
Frameworks for organizing your thoughts.
Exactly. So FIRM, just as a reminder, stands for finances, infrastructure, reputation, and marketplace.
Right. And when focusing internally, the scorecard prompts you to consider finances and infrastructure.
Okay. SWOT analysis, of course, is about identifying strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats.
A classic framework.
Yeah. And then PESTLE. I always have to remember what that one stands for. It's political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors.
Right. And some of those factors will have a direct impact on the internal environment.
Okay, so let's dive into the financial part first. What are some of the key things to consider when assessing, the internal context from a financial perspective?
Biswas highlights several key considerations. First, are there enough funds to support the organization's strategic ambitions?
Right, so can the organization afford to do what it wants to do?
Exactly. Then, are there robust procedures for allocating investment capital?
Making sure that the money is being used wisely, efficiently, and effectively.
Right. And of course, the strength of internal financial controls, preventing fraud, errors, those kinds of things.
Right, so safeguards in place to protect the organization's financial resources.
And finally, are there sufficient funds to cover potential liabilities?
Both expected and unexpected. So basically, making sure there's a financial cushion to absorb any potential shocks.
Exactly. You need to ensure that the financial foundations are solid.
Okay, so that's the financial health check.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the infrastructure aspect. I think this one's quite broad, right?
It covers a wide range of operational aspects.
Yeah, so what are some of the key things to consider under this infrastructure umbrella?
Well, first off, the structure of senior management. How are they organized? And even more importantly, the prevailing risk culture. Is risk awareness embedded at the top?
So are the leaders actually walking the talk?
That's what you need to figure out.
Okay, so leadership and culture. What else?
The availability of skilled personnel. Do they have the right people with the right expertise?
And the organization's intellectual property.
Yes, the knowledge, the expertise, the collective know-how, all those intangible assets.
Right, so people and knowledge. What about physical stuff?
Of course. The adequacy and condition of physical assets.
Buildings, equipment, machinery, all of that.
Are they fit for purpose? Are they well maintained?
Okay, so physical infrastructure. And then what about technology?
Absolutely critical in this day and age. The strength, the resilience, the security of the IT infrastructure.
Right, because so much depends on technology now.
Everything is connected. And of course, data protection measures.
Okay, so IT infrastructure and data security. Anything else under infrastructure?
Business continuity plans. What happens when something goes wrong? Do they have a plan to keep operating?
Right, because disruptions are inevitable.
Exactly. So being prepared is key.
Okay, so business continuity planning. And then what about just the basic operational systems?
Like service delivery, transportation networks, communication systems.
Right, are those reliable?
You need to make sure they're up to the task. So it really depends on the type of organization. For a small online retailer, the reliability of their website and their delivery network is crucial.
Makes sense.
For a manufacturing company, it's all about their production facilities and their supply chains.
Right, so different organizations will have different priorities, but it's all about understanding those core operational systems. Now, Biswas really stresses the importance of connecting this internal context, all this stuff we just talked about, to the organization's overall culture, its resources, and how risk management ultimately influences behavior and governance.
It's about integrating risk management into the very fabric of the organization.
Okay, so it's not just a separate function, it's woven into everything.
Exactly, and it raises some key questions. How does risk management inform decision-making at all levels?
From the top down.
Does the organization have the capacity, the capabilities to manage the risks it faces?
In terms of people, technology, finances.
Right. And are the core business processes themselves resilient? Are they designed with risk in mind?
So it's not just about managing risk, it's about building risk resilience into the organization itself.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've looked inward at the internal context. Now let's shift gears again and turn our attention outward to the external context. This is all about the environment in which the organization operates,
Right.
right? All those factors that are largely beyond its direct control.
The wider world, the big picture.
Right. So we're talking about the organization's industry sector, all of its external stakeholders,
Customers, suppliers, regulators, competitors, the community.
and also the prevailing financial and economic conditions.
And let's not forget the broader societal trends, the things that are happening in the world that could have an impact on the organization.
Right, because those external factors can create both opportunities and threats.
It's about understanding the entire ecosystem.
And Biswas really emphasizes the importance of understanding, the expectations of those external stakeholders, especially customers.
Happy customers, happy business. It's not rocket science.
Right. And he even makes a connection to the ISO 9001.2015 standard, which is all about quality management systems.
Right. That standard highlights the need for organizations to understand their context, including the needs and expectations of their customers and other interested parties.
Okay, so it's about being customer-centric, understanding what your customers want and need.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, satisfied customers drive success.
And loyalty.
And loyalty, yes, which can be significantly impacted by those external risks we talked about, like changes in market demand or what your competitors are doing.
Right, you've got to keep an eye on the competition.
Absolutely. And Biswas also highlights how closely linked the organization's business model itself is to risk management, especially within this external context.
Okay, so how the organization creates, delivers, and captures value is intertwined with the risks it faces in the marketplace.
Exactly. So if your business model is vulnerable to supply chain disruptions, for example, or changes in regulations, then that's a big risk you need to address.
Okay, so the business model itself needs to be designed with risk in mind.
It should be inherently resilient.
And Biswas brings back the firm risk scorecard and the SWOT analysis as useful tools here too.
Right. So for the external context, firm focuses on reputation and marketplace factors.
Okay. SWOT, as always, is about those external opportunities and threats.
Right. And again, these frameworks help to structure your analysis.
Okay, let's break down the reputational risk a bit. What exactly falls under that category when we're looking at the external context?
Reputation is all about how the outside world sees you.
Your image, your brand?
Exactly. So you need to consider what the general public thinks about your industry.
Right, because a bad reputation for the industry can rub off on you.
Exactly. And then there's your organization's track record on corporate social responsibility, ethical practices.
And treat your employees, the environment, all of that.
Right. And the perceived level of governance standards, how transparent and accountable the organization is.
Okay, so public perception, CSR, governance.
And crucially, the quality of your products or services.
Right, because if your products are unreliable or your service is terrible, that's going to hurt your reputation.
And don't forget about after-sales service. How do you handle customer complaints?
Okay, so it's the whole customer experience.
And it makes a big difference. A strong, positive reputation that can be a huge asset in navigating those external risks.
Like a buffer.
Exactly. If you have a good reputation, people are more likely to trust you, even when things go wrong.
Right, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt.
But a negative reputation, well, that can amplify the impact of any risk.
Yeah, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire.
Exactly. So think about a company facing a product recall. If they have a good reputation, they might be able to weather the storm.
But if they have a bad reputation,
people are going to be much less forgiving.
Okay, so reputation matters. Now let's talk about the marketplace component.
The competitive landscape.
Right. So what are some of the key things to consider here?
Well, first off, you need to look at revenue and return on investment. How is the organization performing financially within the marketplace?
Okay, so the bottom line.
Exactly. And then you need to look at the strength of the competition. Who are your rivals? What are they doing? How are they performing?
Right, because your competitors' actions can have a big impact on your own success.
Absolutely. And then there's the ever-changing expectations of customers.
What do they want? What are their needs? What are the trends?
Right. Because if you don't keep up with those evolving expectations, you're going to fall behind.
Okay, so competition and customer expectations.
And then you need to consider the broader economic environment.
Right, the macro stuff.
Exactly. So things like economic stability, interest rates, foreign exchange fluctuations, all of those things can have a big impact on an organization's performance.
Right, and it's stuff they can't control.
Exactly.
Okay, so economic factors. What else?
The supply chain, how complex is it? Are there any vulnerabilities?
Right, because disruptions to the supply chain can be really costly.
Absolutely. And then the cost of raw materials. How volatile are those prices?
Right, because that can impact your profitability.
And finally, any risks stemming from international disruptions.
So political instability, war, terrorism, anything that's happening on a global scale.
Especially for organizations that operate in multiple countries.
Okay, so it's a lot to consider. But Biswas says the ultimate goal of evaluating the external context is basically to understand how risky the environment is,
Right. It's about figuring out how much turbulence you're likely to encounter.
and then to assess whether the current business model is still the right fit for that environment.
Exactly. It's about asking, given all these external pressures and opportunities, is our current way of doing business sustainable?
Right. Or do we need to adapt, change our strategies, our products, maybe even our target markets?
It's about being proactive, anticipating the changes that are happening around you.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We've got the risk management context, the internal context, and the external context.
The stage is set.
Now, Biswas circles back to RASP, risk architecture, strategy, and protocols, and he really dives into each of these in more detail. So let's start with risk architecture. What exactly does the architecture of risk management entail within an organization?
It's the backbone of your risk management efforts.
The framework.
Exactly. And it defines how risk information flows throughout the organization, who's responsible for what, and how risk management is integrated into the overall governance structure.
So it's about clarity, about accountability.
Absolutely. And Biswas really stresses the importance of having clearly defined responsibilities.
Right, so for every significant risk that the organization faces, there should be someone or a team who is accountable.
Exactly. Someone who's responsible for developing the risk mitigation strategy, for implementing those procedures, and for making sure they're followed.
Okay, so no ambiguity, no passing the buck.
Because if it's not clear who's responsible, it's easy for those risks to fall through the cracks.
Right. And Biswas also mentions risk management committees. What are those all about? How do they fit into this architecture?
Risk management committees, they play a crucial role in overseeing and coordinating risk management efforts across the organization.
Okay, so it's not just one person.
Yeah.
It's a team effort.
Right. And their job is to monitor the organization's overall risk exposure, to make sure that risk management activities are being carried out effectively, and to facilitate the sharing of risk information across different departments and business units.
Okay, so they're kind of like the central nervous system for risk management.
That's a good analogy.
And the risk architecture should clearly define, who's on the committee, what their responsibilities are, how they report, and also, importantly, the escalation procedures.
Right. So how do you raise an issue? Who do you go to? Are there whistleblowing policies in place? All of that needs to be spelled out.
Okay, so it's about having a clear chain of command, so to speak, when it comes to risk. And it sounds like the risk architecture also involves, documentation. Some of it is static, like the risk management manual, and some of it is more dynamic, like the risk register.
Exactly. The risk management manual, that's your central repository for all the foundational elements of your risk management framework.
The Bible of risk management, so to speak.
Yeah, it outlines the policies, the processes, the procedures. It's your go-to guide.
Okay. And the risk register?
The risk register is more dynamic, more of a living document. It's essentially an action plan that tracks identified risks, their assessments, the controls that are in place, and the ongoing mitigation efforts.
Okay, so it's constantly being updated. It's a work in progress.
Exactly. And the risk architecture also defines the roles and responsibilities of key oversight functions, like the audit committee, the head of internal audit. And in larger organizations, there might also be a disclosure committee to ensure that risk information is being communicated accurately and transparently to stakeholders.
Right, so it's about making sure that everyone is on the same page.
Exactly. And it sounds like risk management responsibilities are distributed across the organization, right? From individual divisions and business units up to the group level, with ultimate oversight by the board of directors.
The multi-layered approach.
Exactly. Risk management should be everyone's responsibility. So divisional and business unit management, they're responsible for identifying and managing the risks within their specific areas.
Right, so they're on the front lines.
And they typically maintain their own local risk registers.
Okay. And then at the group level, you have those risk management committees we talked about, providing guidance and ensuring a consistent approach across the organization.
Exactly. And reporting structures can vary depending on the organization, but often those risk committees report directly to the board.
Right, so ultimately the board has oversight.
Exactly. But Biswas makes a really important distinction here. While executive management is responsible for managing risk, the oversight of those activities, the auditing, the risk assurance functions, that should reside with non-executive directors, often through the audit committee.
Right, so there's a separation of powers.
Exactly, to ensure objectivity.
Okay, so the executive team manages the risk, but the non-executive directors make sure they're doing it properly. And the bottom line is, the risk architecture needs to be tailored to the specific organization.
One size does not fit all. It has to be designed to meet the organization's unique needs and to address the specific risks that they face.
Okay, so that's architecture. Now let's move on to risk management strategy. What's the strategic element all about?
This is your game plan, your roadmap for dealing with risks. It's the how-to guide.
Okay, so it's the plan of attack.
Exactly. And it outlines how the organization will identify, assess, and respond to the various risks that it faces.
Okay, and this strategy is formally documented in the risk management policy, right?
That's right. It's not just a vague idea, it's written down, it's official,
Mhm.
and it should be closely aligned with the organization's overall strategic objectives.
Right, so risk management is not a separate thing. It's integrated with everything else the organization is trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And Biswas emphasizes the importance of this acronym STOC: strategy, tactics, operations, and compliance.
Right, so risk management touches on all of those areas.
It's woven into the fabric of the organization.
Okay. Now, what about risk appetite? We talked about that earlier, but how does that fit into the strategy?
Risk appetite is a cornerstone of your strategy. It's the level of risk the organization is willing to accept to achieve its goals.
Okay, so you're defining your comfort zone.
Exactly. And you need to make sure that that risk appetite is realistic, that it aligns with the organization's risk capacity, which is basically its ability to absorb potential losses without going bankrupt.
Right, you don't want to bite off more than you can chew.
Exactly. So the strategy outlines the risk appetite, but it also outlines the specific risk management processes the organization will use.
Right, get the how-to.
How are those processes designed? How is it implemented? What's the desired level of maturity for the risk management function? And how is risk management expected to contribute to the overall success of the organization?
Okay, so it's a pretty comprehensive document.
It needs to be. It's the guiding document for how the organization will manage risk.
Okay, so we've got architecture and strategy. Now, the last part of our ASP is risk management protocols. What are those?
Think of these as the detailed instructions, the step-by-step guides for putting that risk management strategy into action.
Okay, so if the strategy is the what, the protocols are the how.
Exactly. They're the specific guidelines, the procedures, the standards that the organization establishes to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Consistency, basically.
Right. And they need to be aligned with that overarching risk management strategy we just talked about.
Okay. And BSWAS gives a whole list of things that are typically covered in these protocols.
It's quite comprehensive.
Yeah. So he talks about the risk identification process, how you actually go about identifying potential risks.
What methods do you use? What tools do you use?
Right. And then the risk assessment process, how you analyze and prioritize those risks.
You need a system for figuring out which risks are the most significant, which ones need to be addressed first.
Okay. So you